All right, this is it's kind of a little bit shorter, I think, video on what's called acts of omission and commission in social work ethics. So these terms are not necessarily specific to social work. Acts of commission and omission are generalized in the world of ethics, but we're going to look at them through the lens of social work ethics. So social workers who face ethical choices, because at this point, you should know that we are all going to face ethical choices at some point. And I think I kind of sometimes fell into this camp as well, that I thought when you're facing an ethical choice, you're always going to be taking some sort of proactive steps. So you're doing something. So when you're doing something, you're making a choice, those are known as acts of commission. So acts of commission occur when individuals initiate some course of action. So if you think back to one of the first lessons that we had about the trolley, where you had to choose to whether to divert the trolley to a different train track to save the workers, or save one person and then it would kill others, blah, blah, blah. Pulling that lever to change the course of the track would be considered an act of commission because you're actively doing something when faced with a dilemma. In contrast, there are instances where social workers do decide not to take a proactive step, so not pulling the lever. That would be considered an act of omission. Now, as we kind of flesh out the commission and omission, I think it's important to know that one or the other isn't inherently bad or unethical to do one or the other. It all depends on the context and the motive behind it. And we're going to do some case examples to kind of show what these look like. So to further build on acts of omission, when social workers decide not to take a proactive step to resolve an ethical dilemma, that's considered an act of omission. Commission is doing something, whether something good to prevent harm, or sometimes it does look like you're doing something that causes harm. An act of omission is not doing anything, which sometimes can prevent harm and sometimes can also cause harm. So again, it's very contextualized. So here's our first case study. You have a social worker who is providing assistance to the unhoused population. They encounter a man who is sleeping outside in the freezing weather. This man seems disoriented, as evidenced by his inability to answer the social worker's questions during a basic mental status exam conducted by the social worker. This obviously concerns the social worker about the man's basic safety, but at the same time is also concerned about about interfering with the man's right to self-determination, which we all know is a core social work value. So here is where the two different things come into play. So the social worker could do an act of commission, and this would look like them engaging in arranging for the man to be escorted to an emergency shelter, thus kind of taking away some of his self-determination. There's some paternalistic vibes to it. So it could be seen as potentially unethical if the man really didn't need the assistance and he was fine. But it would be a positive act of commission if it really was truly in the client's best interest and they were determined that they weren't able to make those decisions by themselves. On the flip, an act of omission would be not doing anything, letting the client stay on the streets, a little disoriented in the freezing weather. Obviously, there's risks with that, frostbite, just general awareness and safety. You don't know if the person is able to make rational choices. So again, omission, it is respecting the client's self-determination despite the risks, but it also could cause harm. The client could die, and then that would be considered unethical and involving harm to the client. So are either unethical? Well, yes, but no. Again, depends on the context. Case study 2. A school social worker is providing counseling to a 16-year-old student who struggles with symptoms of clinical depression. During their work together, the teen disclosed to the social worker that he thinks he is gay, and he's profoundly worried about his parents' reaction given their strict religious beliefs. The teen told the social worker because of this distress, he's been self-medicating with drugs and has cut his wrists on several occasions. The teen has begged the social worker not to share any of this information with his parents. So, what does a social worker do? If the social worker engaged in the act of commission, they would share the information with the parents' teens, even if the disclosure was limited to the information about the teen's drug use and substance abuse. It's still considered an act of commission because the social worker actively chose to do something that was in efforts to maybe resolve this ethical dilemma. Now, it is interesting if you're thinking about mandated reporting. Obviously, it's a minor who is reporting some self-harm, obviously risky behavior. A social worker is not obligated to disclose substance use and non-lethal self-harm. Your mandated reporting does not require that. Obviously, you have to use your clinical judgment to determine if the substance use is actually going to pose a significant risk in the near future, or if the substance use is stemming from something that their parents are doing. But if the teen discloses it and there's no imminent harm, you do not have to break confidentiality. Same thing with the self-harm. As long as you do your clinical assessment, the lethality is low, you do not have to legally disclose that either. But you could, and then again, active commission. Active omission would be if the social worker decided to respect the client's privacy and confidentiality and did not share any information with the parents' teens. So obviously you're choosing not to share anything, but you're not taking an action. You're just going as is, and that's why it's considered an active omission. Now, again, are either of these unethical? Again, context. If, like I was saying, it was the client is shooting heroin every night and they're self-harming, has some suicidal intent behind it, then not sharing that would be considered unethical. If you shared all the information, all the details to the parents against the client's wishes, then that would be unethical as well. So again, context matters, but also knowing kind of the difference between the two and kind of the pros and cons, I think is helpful. So if we're thinking on more of a macro scale, you have a social work administrator of a very large family services agency, discovered that during a financial audit of the agency, the executive director has been engaging in fraudulent activity. So the audit indicates that the executive director diverted more than $75,000 in federal funds to the executive director's discretionary account, which he then used to pay for personal travel and entertainment expenses. The agency has been awarded these federal funds to provide state-of-the-art services to people struggling with major mental illness and addiction. So the social worker learned that the executive director also has a serious gambling problem, which appeared to explain his diversion of agency funds. The social worker has to decide whether to disclose the fraudulent activity to the federal agency that awarded the grant and to law enforcement officials. So this one's a little bit trickier, maybe not, but active commission, you would disclose the information to the federal government. That is going to jeopardize your agency's ability to continue providing services because you'd be not having that money. Although I guess technically the agency wasn't benefiting from the money if the executive director was diverting it. But in this one, it's clear that an active commission would be to tell people about it and not do anything. An active omission, you would not disclose in order to protect the executive director and the agency. That would be the active omission. Now that is, if you choose to do that, that one is clearly unethical. You have knowledge. You're part of the code of ethics talks about the obligation to our peers. And so this person is obviously not acting in an ethical manner. Now it might be a little dicey if the executive director isn't a social worker. They're not held by the code of ethics, but the social worker itself is held by it. And so if they know that harm is going on, they do have to report it. So engaging in an act of omission in this situation would be considered unethical. Sharing it would be ethical. That one, I guess, maybe is a little bit more clear-cut than I thought. All right, and then the final one, a licensed social worker is treating an isolated elderly client diagnosed with severe depression and early-stage cognitive decline. The social worker deliberately memorizes the credit card or the client's credit card information and actively initiates recurring unauthorized transactions. And to cover their tracks, the social worker fabricates bills, claiming the charges are for overtime telephone therapy and home organizational services. So I put this one in there because I wanted to show what an act of commission looks like when it is clearly unethical. So on this one, yes, this is definitely unethical. The social worker exploits the cognitive vulnerability of the client for personal financial gain. Also, by draining the client's services, the worker intentionally creates a false sense of financial dependency. This ensures the client remains trapped in therapy and unable to afford alternative care options. So you can see in this case, there is a clear act of commission that's unethical. But if you go back to case study 3, the act of commission would be the ethical choice because you're disclosing a person's fraudulent activity. So I don't want you to, if you're like memorizing these terms, you can't think of commission is good, omission is bad, because there's a lot of nuances. It's to remember, like at the core, commission is doing an intentional action either for good or for bad. And omission is not taking any action. So staying at the status quo, which again, can be good, also can be bad, just depends on the situation. So to wrap this up, Reamer, our ethics guy, he says ethical judgments in complex cases often call for distinguishing between acts of commission and acts of omission in whole or in part. So you're looking at, is action going to hurt or harm? Is not doing something going to hurt or harm? So some ethical judgments require acts of commission, some require acts of omission, and some require elements of both. But it's important to know that social workers can be held accountable for acts of commission and omission. Appreciating these nuances, I hope we really appreciate them, but if we lean into it and appreciate it, these nuances are part of the art of ethical decision making. So just a layer, I think obviously when we are faced with an ethical dilemma, we're actually going to do something or not do something. But knowing kind of the consequences or benefits of either just adds kind of another layer of understanding to our lovely ethical decision-making process. There you go.